Welcome to our program on Kardec Radio.
Good evening, my dear friends. I'm Geraldo Lemos Neto, and I'm here with Marco Gandra from Portal Saber Spiritismo in Belo Horizonte, Brazil. Welcome to program to know Spiritism number 122. And tonight we are going to start another series of studies according to Spiritism, invoking the last book of Allan Kardec, the Genesis. And we are going to study the mediumship of prophecy according to Spiritism, and also the book of Revelations that we can call also the Apocalypse. First, let's talk about the last book of Allan Kardec. It was published in the 6th of January, 1868 in Paris, at the Librairie Internationale. And it was a little more 1 year before Allan Kardec's death. We can see the Portuguese cover, commonly known as only the Genesis, but the real title of this book is the Genesis, the miracles, and the predictions according to Spiritism. So that it is an important part of this book, the study of the predictions, the prophecy mediumship. As we can see here in French, la Genèse, les miracles et les prédictions selon l'Spiritisme by Allan Kardec. And the frontispiece of the book, as we know. We made some researches on this book, The Genesis of Allan Kardec, and we found that one of Allan Kardec's biographer, Mr. Henri Sauce, in 1884 and 1885, denounced that this book was altered. His denunciation was made public by this publication in infamy on the Spiritism Review in France, in Paris. And he brought up an important information, Mr. Henri Sauce, that after the 5th edition of 1872 of Allan Kardec's last book, it was revised, corrected, and augmented by Mr. Pierre Gaëtan Lemarie. In other words, the 5th edition on, it's not the thoughts and the mind of Allan Kardec. It was altered, it was revised, and augmented by Mr. Lemarie. That's why we prefer to use until the 4th edition, because that one had the eyes and the care of Allan Kardec himself. As we know, these new researches on this book is also proved by Mr. Simone Privato Goidanich. She is a Brazilian that lives in Argentina and published there in Buenos Aires in the 1st edition in Spanish, and also we have the Portuguese edition of her book. It's the El Legado de Allan Kardec, the legacy of Allan Kardec, where Mr. Simone Privato Goidanich explained to us why only up to the 4th edition we have for certain that Allan Kardec wrote it. Also, we can relate here two books wrote by Mr. Adriano Calzoni from the interior of the state of São Paulo on the researches that he had with the help of the French Spiritists, and published about the era of Spiritism in France after the death of Allan Kardec. So he focused this study looking towards Spiritism in France after Kardec's death. His first book, it's a very interesting book that is called in Portuguese Em Nome de Kardec, in English, In the Name of Kardec, where he talks about the deviations that the Spiritist movement there in Paris and also in the rest of France and also in Belgium had after the death of Allan Kardec, accepting the influence of the Theosophy doctrine by Mr. Blavatsky, and that this interference was very bad for the work of Allan Kardec, for the originality of Kardec's work in Europe. And after this first book, he published another one where he focused the life and the struggles of Mrs. Kardec, our beloved Mrs. Boudet, Amélie Gabrielle Boudet, that was the wife of Allan Kardec, all the struggles that she had with Mr. Gaëtan Lemarie, with the Spiritist movement that was driving away of Kardec's originality, and also the troubles that she had to maintain the control of the Spiritist Review, of the Spiritist Library in Paris, and also on the Spiritist Society of Paris. And his book is called Madame Kardec, in Portuguese, A História que o Tempo Quase Apagou, in English, Madame Kardec, the history that times almost erased. So these three books make sense of the deviations of this last portion of the life of Allan Kardec, especially the deviations that the Spiritist movement on France and in Europe as a whole had towards his last two books, the Genesis, and also the other one, the predecessor, and all the struggles that they faced after Kardec's death. But let's talk about a little bit of this book as Kardec himself conceived. First of all, when he was writing it, he had a message by the Spirit of the Truth that urged him to finish his last work, because they were waiting him in the spiritual realm so that he could prepare himself for a little while and then to return back to earth in the next century. That's why we for sure know that he returned as Chico Xavier. So in that first orientations for his book, he formally separated it in three parts. The first part, where he talked about the Genesis. The second part, where he talked about the miracles. And the third part, where he talked about the predictions. But later on, Kardec himself thought that it was very important to add one booklet that he already had published that was called The Character of the Spiritist Revelation. And so that he made this booklet the first chapter of his last book, so that we can reason that his last book has materially 4 different parts. The first part is this booklet called The Character of Spiritist Revelation. The second one is the part that study the Genesis of earth, and also the Genesis of life. The third part is the one that talks about the miracles that Jesus and the apostles performed as natural laws that are not understood by human science up to that part. And the last one, the predictions according to Spiritism, where Allan Kardec himself wrote a theory of pre-science. In Portuguese, a teoria da presciência, and in English, the theory of pre-science. That, in other words, is the theory of the mediumship of prophecy, how it processes, how it is done, how the spirits, the higher spirits, choose the mediums that can see the future. And they explain to us how and in what conditions this is possible. And in this part also, it's very important part of the Spiritist doctrine, because in this last part, Allan Kardec also talks about the transition times, the times of transition here on earth, where we are all facing the latter days of the human sufferings, trials, and proofs, and we can foresee the dawn of another era, the era of regeneration. And so that this is a very sensitive and very important part of this book. When the book was published, we can reason that Allan Kardec was already a very experienced and very mature man on all matters regarding and relating to the mediumship knowledge and the Spiritist doctrine. So we have a very mature Allan Kardec after almost 15 years of devoted work and studies, after almost 15 years in contact with the higher spirits through different mediums, not only in Paris, France, but all over the world, mainly in very different French parts, also in Belgium, in Britain and other countries. And so that when he published his first edition of the Genesis, the Miracles and Predictions According to Spiritism, in January 6, 1868, he had already completed 14 years after he started studying and researching on the matter. And also, it is noted that this book was published 1 year prior of Allan Kardec's death that occurred in the 31st of March of 1869. So, we are going to see the first part of the book, the character of the Spiritus revelation. What is the source of credible information for Spiritism? Allan Kardec asks. And as we can see in this first chapter, item 3, the Spiritus wrote to him, the essential characteristic of any revelation has to be the truth. So we're going to stop here to meditate again about this very profound saying of the higher spirits to Allan Kardec. And in the next week, we are going to talk about this first part, the character of the Spiritus revelation, and why we must understand that the only source of credible information from the higher spirits and from mediumship has to be essentially any revelation that is related to the truth. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to have you back in the next program to know Spiritism number 123 next week for Kardec Radio, for Spiritism Dissemination, and also for DSN, Discover Spiritism Network. This was the program to know Spiritism. Bye-bye.